Welcome to New American Mythos, where old stories are kindled like firelight, and we gather round to remember the tales that shaped us. We've stood in halls of gold and watched dragons fall. We've seen tyrants struck down by faithful hands. But not every stand ends in triumph. Today we come to a windswept shore in the year 991 AD, to a narrow causeway, a rising tide, and an old warrior who would not give ground. This is the story of Byrhtnoth, ealdorman of East Anglia, Christian, patriot, and man of pride. What follows is not a tale of victory, but it is not defeat either. It is the kind of story a people carry, long after swords have rusted and names have faded, a story of what it costs to keep the line. By this point in the season, you know the world. Stone churches on wind-lashed cliffs, coastal towns that lived on trade and prayer, and a land that bore the scars of long-forgotten wars. But now, in this moment, the scars were opening again. The crown in England sat on the head of Ethelred, young, uncertain, and poorly advised. The realm was fractured. Trust in the king was thin, and from across the sea, the Danes kept coming. They weren't conquerors in the old way. They were raiders, fast, cruel, and always moving. A monastery burned, a village stripped, a nobleman captured and ransomed, then silence, and then always another ship. The king's answer was silver. Year after year, he paid them off. Danegeld, or Danish gold, they called it, tribute in exchange for peace. But it never lasted. And not every lord agreed with the strategy. Byrhtnoth of East Anglia was old enough to remember better days, and strong enough to defy the drift toward fear. He had governed long and honorably. He gave to churches, he trained men in the old way, and when the raiding ships came to Maldon, he didn't wait for orders. He gathered the feared, he called the local freemen, and he rode to meet the tide with sword in hand. The story that we have that still survives is part poem, part prayer. It records not just what Byrhtnoth and his men did, but what they believed about duty, about loyalty, about what it means to fall with your banner still raised. And in some ways, the spirit of this story even inspires the courageous stand at Fort McHenry, where the Star-Spangled Banner was penned. It begins not with the first clash, but with the first choice. And so does our telling. A quick note about how we've chosen to tell this story. What follows is, like the others, a modernized retelling of the poem known as the Battle of Maldon. Now, the original text survives only in fragment. The beginning and end were lost in the Ashburnham house fire of 1731. To shape this episode, therefore, we've added a brief narrative introduction and a prose conclusion. Each one will be clearly marked in the recording, and they are there to frame the story with imagined but historically grounded moments. These bookends help give closure to what the surviving poem leaves incomplete. The central poem has been carefully modernized into narrative verse, keeping much of its spirit and structure, but updating the language for today's listener. Where possible, echoes of Old English remain, bold imagery, a few select kennings, and a cadence meant to honor the original's rhythm. Names of key warriors have been preserved. Because some of these names and characters are old and unfamiliar to us, I want to give you just a quick guide here. Here are some of the key characters. Byrhtnoth was an ealdorman, or a leader, of East Anglia. He's also the leader of the English force in this story. Godric. He is a coward who flees the field, shaming his name. And the group of loyal warriors who stand with Byrhtnoth. Elfwine, Dunari, Leofsnu, and Ofa. These are the voices that carried the memory, and these are the names that the poem has kept. Now let us enter the story, where the tide falls, the stones show, and the tale begins. Prose intro that we wrote. The people of Essex lived between marsh and sea, in a land threaded with rivers, farms, and low hills that turned gold in the late summer sun. Their homes were simple, their fields narrow, and their customs already old. The rhythms of the land had not changed in living memory. Seed time, harvest, fasts and feasts, the ringing of the monastery bell, the lowing of cattle at dusk, the chanting of psalms in stone chapels along the coast. But in the year of our Lord 991, peace had thinned like mist over the fenlands. England was still a Christian realm. The churches stood, and the Gospels were read in both Latin and English. The king ruled from his hall in Winchester, bishops held synods, and old men spoke with pride of Alfred, who had held back the heathen tide a century before. But the tide had never truly gone out. The Northmen continued to return. Not with armies this time, but with raids, swift and brutal. They came like smoke, burning a village here, taking a monastery there, vanishing before swords could be drawn. They were no longer just sea wolves. They were testing England, probing its edges, growing bolder with each passing season. Silver was paid, and paid again. Danegeld, they called it, gold for peace. But peace bought with gold is a brittle thing. It was in that year, as the days began to shorten and the grain ripened under a sky of smoky blue, that a fleet of longships was seen beyond the mouth of the Panté. They did not come for tribute. They came for ground. The king was young. His counsel was slow. But in Essex, one man did not wait. Byrhtnoth, ealdorman of East Anglia, was called to hold the coast. He was an old warrior, gray of beard, strong in stature, beloved by his men. He had governed long and well, and was known not only for courage, but for mercy. He was a Christian man, a patron of churches, a keeper of law, and he was no stranger to war. When the summons came, he gathered his household guard, called up the fyrd, and rode to Maldon. Maldon was no fortress. It was a market town with little more than a church, a quay, and a few winding lanes. But it stood near a narrow causeway between land and island, a place where an army could cross at low tide, and so Byrhtnoth made his stand there, not for the town, but for the country behind it. The people of Essex watched as their earl prepared the field. They brought what they could, salt, grain, wool, bread. They watched their sons hammer spear points and mend old mail. They listened to the priest's blessing as the men gathered beneath the white cross sewn into Byrhtnoth's banner, and they waited for the sea to give up its threat. The morning the ships arrived, the tide was still high. The river gleamed like a blade in the gray light. Across the water stood the Viking host, dark shields, tall helms, and the glint of spears. But the English stood ready, and Byrhtnoth dismounted among them, sword at his side, the wind in his cloak. He raised his hand, not in fear, but in order. The old man knew what was coming, and still he gave thanks. Modernized poetry section from the original manuscript. Then the earl commanded each young man to release his horse and drive it far off, and go forward on foot, hands ready for battle, hearts set firm with courage. Then Offa's kinsman was first to see that the Lord would not abide cowardice. He let his beloved hawk fly free from his hands toward the woods, and then, unencumbered with sport, stepped into the fray. By that, one could tell the young man would not waver in war when once he took up arms. Likewise, Eadric meant to support his lord, his master in the fight. He raised his spear and stepped into battle, while he could still grip shield and broadsword with steady hands. He held to the vow he had made before, that he would fight in front of his lord. Then Byrhtnoth began to marshal his men. He rode and gave counsel, instructing his warriors how they should stand and hold that ground, and urged them to hold their shields upright, gripped firm in their hands, and not to be afraid. When he had arranged his men with grace, he dismounted among them, where it pleased him most, where he knew his hearthguard stood most loyal. Then there stood on the shore a Viking herald, stern-voiced, who shouted and spoke aloud. In bold boast he delivered the seafarer's message to Byrhtnoth, who stood across the river. "Sea warriors have sent me to speak. They bid you send quickly a ransom of rings in exchange for peace, and it would be better for you to buy off this spear storm with tribute, rather than to join us in hard battle. There's no need for slaughter, if you're wise. We'd rather trade peace for gold. If you who hold power here wish to ransom your people and buy their safety, then give to these sailors on their own terms money for peace, and take truce from us. We'll go back to our ships with the silver, depart on the sea, and keep peace with you." The Earl, Byrhtnoth, spoke then, lifting his shield, waving a slender ash spear, and gave his answer. Angry and resolute, he declared, "Have you heard, sailor, what this people say? We will give you tribute, but tribute of spears, poisoned points, and ancient swords, war gear that will bring you no gain in battle. Messenger of seafarers, take this message back. Tell your people a grimmer tale, that here stands an earl, unshamed, with his men, ready to defend his homeland. The realm of Aethelred, my lord and king, his people, and this land. The heathen shall fall in battle. It would be shameful to me if you went to your ships with our silver, unfought. Now you've come this far, into our country. You shall not win gold so easily. Point and edge must settle this first. Grim war play before we give tribute." Then he commanded shields to be lifted, and the warriors to advance, all who stood on the eastern riverbank. Yet neither array could reach the other, for the tide still flowed in from the sea. Waters ran deep between them. Too long, it seemed, before they could meet and bring their spears to bear. So there they stood along the Ponte stream, the East Saxon front and the Viking host. None could strike the other, except by arrow flight, and some found death. The tide went out. Then the seafarers stood ready, many Vikings eager for battle. Then the shelter of warriors ordered the bridge held. A war-hardened fighter named Wulfstan, bold among his kin. He was Siola's son, and it was he who struck down the first Viking who dared boldly step onto that bridge. With Wulfstan stood warriors unafraid, Aelfiri and Maccus, two proud men who would not retreat from the ford, but held their ground and fought the foe so long as they were able to wield their weapons. When the enemy saw and clearly perceived that they had met fierce bridge wardens there, the hateful guests began to scheme. They begged permission to cross the ford while the tide was out rather than over the bridge, to bring their foot troops safely to the shore. Then, out of too much pride, Byrhtnoth allowed it. He granted too much land to that hated people. Byrhthelm's son then called across the cold water, loud enough that all his men could hear. "Now the way is open. You come swiftly to us, you men to battle. God alone knows who will rule the field of slaughter." Let's pause here for a moment. Here is the choice that echoes. Not A mistake, exactly, but a decision that cost dearly. Why would Byrhtnoth allow this? Why would he allow the Vikings to cross from their small spit of land, their island really out in the bay? Why would he allow them the easy crossing during the low tide, rather than forcing them to fight their way over the bridge? Why would he order the bridge defenders to stand down? Was it honor, that old warrior's code? Was it pride, that deadly thing the poets called offermad? Or was it something else, a kind of virtue turned sideways? Sometimes we allow a great evil because it comes wrapped in the form of something good: fairness, dignity, a chance to prove ourselves. But not all virtue is rightly ordered, and not every honorable posture is wise. Sometimes the enemy asks permission, and we, hoping to be just, say yes. Let's get back into the story. And then the sea wolves of slaughter waded forth, the Viking host, untroubled by the water. Yet across the Ponte they advanced. Over the shining stream they bore their shields. Sea warriors coming ashore, linden shields lifted. There, standing ready to meet the enemy, Byrhtnoth stood with his men. He ordered them to form a shield wall with their boards and hold the line, firm against the foe. Then battle drew near, glory in the fight. The time had come when doomed men would fall. There rose a great shout. Ravens wheeled above. Eagles hungered for carrion. A cry broke out across the earth. They let fly from their hands hard-forged spears. Sharpened javelins shot through the air. Bows were busy. Shields took the brunt. The clash was bitter. Warriors fell on either side. Young men lay dead. Wulfmire was wounded. He chose the bed of slaughter. He was Byrhtnoth's kinsman, his sister's son, and he was cruelly hewn down with swords. Then the Vikings were given repayment. I heard that Eadweird struck down one, hard with the sword, not holding back his blow, so that a doomed warrior fell at his feet. For that, his lord gave him thanks when the chance came. So the young warriors stood firm of heart, each thinking keenly on whom they might first strike down with their spear points, snatching life from the doomed. Steel rang and blood fell upon the earth. They stood fast in place. Byrhtnoth directed them, urging every man to stand his ground who wished to earn glory in fighting the Danes. Then a battle-bold warrior stepped forth, heaving his weapon, shield in hand, and advanced against Byrhtnoth. Just as boldly, Byrhtnoth strode forward to meet that man, each one intent on bringing death to the other. The sea warrior hurled a southern spear. It wounded the lord of warriors. Byrhtnoth thrust it aside with his shield, so the shaft burst. The spearhead sprang backwards. Enraged, the battle-hardened earl struck back with his own spear, wounding the proud Viking who had pierced him. That seasoned soldier drove his weapon through the young man's neck, his hand steady, and took that raider's life. Then, quickly he struck another. Bursting the mail shirt, he wounded him in the breast, through the ring links. The poisoned point lodged in his heart. The earl rejoiced. That brave man laughed and gave thanks to the measurer for the day's work the Lord had granted him. But then, one of the enemy warriors threw a spear from afar. It flew too true, piercing the noble thane of Aethelred. At his side stood a young warrior, a boy in the battle, who bravely drew the bloody spear from his lord's body. That was Wulfstan's son, Wulfmire the Young. He returned the spear in kind. It drove in deep, so that he who had struck down the lord was himself struck low. Then an armed man came at Byrhtnoth. He hoped to seize the old earl's rings, his armor, his decorated sword. But Byrhtnoth drew his blade from its sheath, broad with a dark gleaming edge, and struck at the Viking's mail coat. Too quickly, though, the seafarer struck back, wounding Byrhtnoth's arm. and his gold-hilted sword fell to the earth. He could no longer hold the hardened blade or wield his weapon. Still, the gray-haired warrior spoke. He emboldened his men, urging them forward as good companions, though he himself could no longer stand firm on his feet. And then he looked to heaven and said, "I thank you, ruler of nations, for all the joys I've known in this world. Now, gentle measurer, I have greatest need that you grant good to my soul, that it may journey to you, go into your keeping, Lord of angels, and depart in peace. I beseech you, let not the fiends of hell harm it." Then the heathen warriors struck him down, and both men who stood beside him, Byrhtnoth and Wulfmare, they fell as well, laying down their lives beside their lord. Then some turned away from battle, those who refused to remain. Oda's son was first to flee. Godric fled from the fight, and left the good man who had given him many a horse in years past. Let's pause again here. Not everyone holds the line. Not everyone stays when the leader falls. When Godric fled on Byrhtnoth's horse, he looked like a man with permission, as if his flight were part of the plan. But it wasn't. And because of it, courage cracked. One coward can break many hearts. One false signal can scatter a faithful few. Let it be a warning to those who lead and to those who follow. Even the faithless can wear a noble disguise, and the fall of a good man may tempt others to retreat. Let's finish the story. Godric leapt on the steed that had belonged to his lord, wearing that war gear to which he had no right. And his brothers with him fled as well. Godwin and Godwig, they cared nothing for the battle, but turned from the fight and sought the woods, fleeing into the forest to save their lives. Then many more fled, more than was right. If they had remembered the favors their lord had done for them, as Ulfa had said earlier that day, in the meeting hall when council was held, that many would speak proudly who would not stand fast when hardship came. Then the leader of the people was fallen. Aethelred's earl and all his hearth retainers saw that their lord lay dead. Then the proud thanes pressed forward, undaunted men, eager in heart. They all resolved on one of two things, to lose their lives or to avenge their lord. And so did the son Aelfric urge them on, a warrior young in winters, but who spoke boldly. Aelfwine then said, speaking with courage, "Remember the words we so often spoke when we sat at mead, boasting on the bench, warriors in the hall, talking of fierce battles. Now we shall see who is truly brave. I will show my lineage to all. I was of noble Mercian blood. My grandfather was named Ilhelm, a wise alderman, wealthy in the world. Let no man reproach me in that land that I would leave this battle and seek my home. Now that my lord has fallen, hewn down in war, that is my greatest sorrow. He was both my kinsman and my lord." Then he advanced, mindful of the feud, and with his spear struck one among the enemy, so that he fell to the ground, cut down by Aelfric's weapon. Then Aelfric called on his comrades, his friends and kinsmen, to advance as well. Prose conclusion that we wrote. Byrhtnoth died before the sun reached its height. His sword slipped from his hand, his shield was split in two. The men around him held the line as long as they could. Some stood over his body, some pressed forward into the Viking ranks, crying out his name. Others turned and ran. Eventually the field scattered. The shield wall broke. The Vikings surged forward, fierce and fast, cutting through what was left. A few of the younger Englishmen tried to regroup near the church, but they were too few. The rest were cut down where they stood. One fell by the riverbank, face down in the reeds. Another near the bridge, his arm still wrapped around a broken spear. By the time the light began to fade, the fighting was over. The Vikings took what they could carry: rings, swords, food, shields, silver if they found it. But they didn't stay. Too many of their own were dead. They burned what they couldn't carry, and before nightfall they were gone, back to their ships and out with the tide. The field was quiet again. In the morning, the villagers came down from the hills. The smoke was still drifting over the grass. The animals had not returned. The dead were everywhere. They moved carefully, not speaking much. Some carried shovels, some carried linen, some just walked, looking from body to body. They found Byrhtnoth by the edge of the river, where the mud met the stones. His mail was torn open, his hand was empty, his eyes were closed. Around him lay Wolfmare, Byrhtnoth, and others they knew by name. Still others were hard to recognize. They laid the bodies on wagons and covered them with cloaks. The priest came down from the chapel and walked among them, anointing the dead, whispering prayers. They gathered the weapons that could be salvaged. Someone found the broken pole of Byrhtnoth's banner. They wrapped it in cloth and carried it home. They buried Byrhtnoth in the churchyard, near the east wall, where the light touched first in the morning. The others were laid beside him, as many as could be named. A few were buried where they had fallen, under mounds of earth near the ford. No one spoke of moving them. It seemed right that they should stay where they had made their stand. For days afterward, the people came to look. Children were told not to speak near the graves. The priests marked the names in the book. A woman came to leave a sprig of yarrow by the place where her son had fallen. A blacksmith brought a blade that had been his brother's and laid it down with the others, to be melted and recast. The fields went quiet again. The sheep returned. The roads were cleared. The fords were used again. The tide came in and went out as it always had. But if you asked someone in those parts about the battle, even years later, they would stop what they were doing and tell you. They would tell you where they were when the ships came. They would tell you what they saw from the ridge. They would tell you who stayed and who didn't. They would tell you how long the smoke lingered, how the bells rang late that day, how the old earl never raised his voice, even at the end. And they would tell you what he said, Byrhtnoth, before the first spear flew, when he stood with his hearthmen by the river and looked across the tide. The final lines we have in the poem are words of loyalty, warriors declaring they will not leave, that their courage grows as their hope fades, and then silence. The rest of the manuscript was lost, ashes in a fire in 1731, but some say we already have the ending, because what needed remembering had been remembered. The names, the stand, the words that echo when the shield wall breaks. The Battle of Maldon is not a story of triumph. It is a story of how to remember, of what we do when good men fall, of what it means to hold the line even when others run. These are not foreign themes to the American mythos. We too carry tales of faithful stands and foolish pride, of lines drawn and crossed, of lesser men who wore borrowed strength, and better men who stood fast when all seemed lost. We remember Lexington, Valley Forge, Little Round Top, not only because they were victories, but because they showed what courage can mean when the outcome is not guaranteed. Maldon is older, but The echo carried across the sea, into the founding imagination, into the spiritual soil of a people who would one day pledge their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor, and ask whether it was better to die free than to live bought. And so this story remains, flawed, faithful, and unfinished, just like the men who told it. Next time, we set sail with a pilgrim who chased the edge of the map. St. Brendan's voyage awaits. Join us then for more truth told in tale. Thank you for listening to New American Mythos. If you enjoyed this tale of loyalty and loss, subscribe on your favorite podcast app and share the story with someone who loves old truths in new firelight. Support us on Patreon for early access and bonus episodes, including tales of St. Edmund and St. Cuthbert coming at the end of the season, and also the full audiobook that we're producing this season coming out in April. Your support keeps the lantern lit and ensures these old stories can speak anew. Thank you for walking this road with us.